All right, so this is our last segment. We had ended up looking at step 5, which we're still looking at, and we had looked at 2 different types of satisfied consumers. Now we're going to look at what determines satisfaction. First and foremost, in what determines satisfaction is that the product must meet the consumer's expectancies, right? Makes perfect sense. That's intuitive. However, remember that those expectancies must be met regardless of whether they are realistic or not. Consumers have expectancies prior to buying, and the product must meet them for their satisfaction, regardless of whether they're based on fact or fantasy, based on false or true information. So first and foremost, it's got to meet their expectancies. If the product is below expectations, the customer ends up being dissatisfied. If the product is equal or slightly above the expectancies, the consumer is satisfied. And if it is significantly better than expected, the consumer is supra-satisfied. Now, this creates an interesting paradox for marketers called the satisfaction paradox. It's a conundrum for marketers because they must create expectancies sufficiently high enough to induce a purchase, but not so high as to engender disappointment, right? So this works as a really powerful consumer advocacy program as long as the business plans on sticking around. So finish this phrase for me. If it sounds like something is too good to be true, finish that. And if you said it probably is, you're correct. That is the, you might call, adage of the times. So if it sounds like it's too good to be true, it probably is. It's a good indication usually of a fraud. A company not planning on sticking around long enough to suffer from the post-purchase evaluation effects. Many TV-only offers are only advertised for a limited amount of time with the goal of short period sales. So you want to be particularly critical of those. So the minimum for satisfaction is that the purchase must meet the consumer's expectancies no matter what they are. But meeting expectancies doesn't always guarantee satisfaction. Sometimes consumers are affected by the performance of the product in a manner that is higher than their expectancies. Sometimes they judge it by not just the goal performance, but the potential performance. So they might buy, let's say, a Honda Civic because they heard that oftentimes, consumers find them still on the road and fairly reliable, even when they have 350,000 miles on them. And so, you might go out and buy a Honda Civic for that reason. And you might even tell your family and friends, I will be happy if I get 200,000 miles out of it. But then you are not necessarily satisfied if you get 200,000 miles on it. Just from knowing that others got 350,000 miles can create dissatisfaction on your part. So product performance must always meet the expectancies, but sometimes it must also meet performance potential for satisfaction. Now we have a tendency after we buy something to think, what if I had chosen the other? Ever heard of buyer's remorse? This is a tendency to compare the chosen product with the rejected alternative. So even if the brand seems superior, still the human tendency is to ask yourself, did I make the right decision? And to compare the chosen brand with the rejected alternative. If the chosen product seems to be inferior, this can create a lot of cognitive dissonance, which of course leads to dissatisfaction. But the alternative is also true. Even if the chosen brand proves to be superior, there is still a human tendency to experience some of that what if thinking, a little cognitive dissonance. You're darned if you do, and you're darned if you don't. So let's explore this psychological phenomenon called cognitive dissonance a little bit further here. Look at this name coming up again, Festinger. Remember Leon Festinger in earlier in this lecture? We found out that he was the one who came up with social comparison theory. So he also came up with cognitive dissonance theory and did a lot of research evidencing this phenomenon, this what if thinking, called cognitive dissonance. And you know what? This what if thinking, after you make a purchase decision, commit to it, it's not really pleasant, right? It's not a pleasant kind of arousal. So we're motivated to reduce it. And there are only 4 ways to reduce it. We have to do it in one or more of these 4 ways. So first possibility is to increase your rating of the chosen product. In other words, mine rocks, right? To think that even more. And this is nicknamed sweet lemons. So studies have found that at times people deal with cognitive dissonance by rating products higher after buying them compared to when they made the purchase commitment. Second way is to decrease your rating of the rejected alternative, right? So you might think to yourself, I didn't really care about those 2 extra features in that one anyway, right? So this one is nicknamed sour grapes. So studies have found that at times people deal with cognitive dissonance by rating an alternative lower after making the decision than before they made the decision. The third way is to level the playing field by perceiving them as more similar. In other words, you might think to yourself, there's not really an important difference between them. Studies have found that at times people rate a purchased product and the alternative as more similar after making the purchase decision than they did before. And then fourth is revoking the decision. So of course, sometimes people deal with cognitive dissonance by taking a product back for an exchange or a refund. So all 4 of these serve to reduce cognitive dissonance. But which 3 do you think are the easiest and thus the most likely? And that would be the first 3. Because all they involve is changing an attitude. And you know what? That's easier than changing your behavior. That is easier than involving the behavior of bringing the product back. So when do you think that consumers tend to deal with cognitive dissonance by revoking the decision? Usually only with high levels of cognitive dissonance and low levels of satisfaction, right? So let's go back to our list here now. What determines satisfaction? Another factor that can determine a consumer's satisfaction is how complaints are handled with this company. Research finds that companies are best off viewing complaints as this great opportunity to build trust. An effective resolution can really improve consumer relations with a company, can improve consumer retention, keeping your customers, reduces damaging word of mouth, and improves profitability over the long term. Okay, so a lot of advantages of really looking at this as an opportunity, to build trust with that client. And again, this is only going to matter if it's not a fly-by-night company, right? If they don't expect to stick around, why would they care about this? Okay, but when it's an established company, they really have to worry about complaint handling and giving that a priority and viewing that, how we think of something, how we frame it in our minds really affects how we act. And to view that as this great opportunity to build trust. is really beneficial. Now, what about that trust? What is perceived justice on the point of clients? So it's really important that consumers feel that their complaints are handled with justice. And there's 3 different types of justice that we as consumers always perceive in these instances. And one of them is called procedural justice. In the procedure of handling the complaint, okay, did the company act responsibly and respond quickly? And when I say act responsibly, did they take responsibility? Did they accept that responsibility as theirs? The product not being satisfactory to you, did they take it as their responsibility, or did they try to push the blame back on you? And did they respond quickly? So those are the major things in the procedural justice, in the procedures and how they handle this. But the second one is interaction justice. So in other words, how did they interact with you throughout this process? Did they treat you politely? Did they treat you with respect and honesty? Did they show empathy through your complaint process? Did they show empathy, like they felt bad that you had to go through this experience? And then the third one is called distributive justice. Was the compensation fair in terms of material compensation first? And when I say material, I mean could be repair, could be a refund, it could be they offer you a replacement. Okay, so was it fair in terms of material compensation, and was it fair in terms of psychological compensation? And I'll tell you what can go the very farthest in psychological compensation is an apology. It can go a long way, right? Just a simple and sincere apology. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that 1 or 2 of these is not going to do. All 3 of them must be perceived as just in order for a consumer to be satisfied. The cost of dissatisfied customers is very high for any company that plans to stick around. Dissatisfied customers often react with revenge and avoidance. So let's start with revenge. Spreading the word, right? This is much more potent than ever before now with the internet. Usually, revenge dissipates, goes down over time, and is not repeated. But there's something called echoers. Those are people who are responding to the original rant by somebody, for instance, on the internet. And they can carry it on much longer than the original source. Now, dissatisfied consumers tend to also react with avoidance, avoiding the company, avoiding the brand. And I'll tell you something, unlike revenge, avoidance tends to increase over time. The most revenge and avoidance are actually generated by the very best customers when they're dissatisfied, because those are the customers that had the best relationship with the company before. They are going to feel the most betrayed, right? So remember what Duran called these users heavy users. And in fact, he showed with his 20-80 rule that 20% of the customers buy 80% of the product. You don't want to lose one of those customers, right? Now, to conclude this lecture, I promised you at the end of each lecture that I would give you a few tips derived from the material on how to be a wiser consumer. Just a few to get you started. You could think of more, right? And I also promised to end each one with a really fun guerrilla marketing example. So to start out with our tips, okay, tip number one, 20% off from what? Remember that one lowball marketing trick that is used sometimes to alleviate monetary perceived risk is to mark up first, then advertise the percentage off. There are phone apps now where you can actually compare prices at different stores to see if their original claim really is realistic. Okay? Now, Tip number 2, okay, remember that it can be a marketing tool or a trick, right? So for example, offering a return period with no questions asked is definitely a marketing tool. And it's great. We love it. Okay, but a marketing trick is unreasonably priced extended warranties. And a good way around this is to read reviews. So you can calculate the likelihood that the product will fail during the plan term and multiply that by the cost of the repair. Still a gamble, but a much more informed one with probability on your side instead, right? And tip number 3, protect against sunk cost effects. Remember that? And cognitive dissonance of resources invested. So when you have a lot of time invested in finding something instead of settling for less, right? And just buying because you've invested all this time. Hey, try committing to a 3-day sabbatical. In other words, taking yourself out of that situation, waiting 3 days to make a decision. What's really cool about this is sometimes you forget all about it. That's an easy decision, right? And if not, then maybe you do want to think it through more carefully and maybe it is a good deal for you. But that's a really nice beginning test. Now for your very fun guerrilla marketing example for this lecture. How do you like that?